A voice, trembling but clear, cuts through the silence. One minute, we were singing campfire songs. The next, we were fighting for our lives. Another voice, a local resident, still struggling to process it all. I mean, that is a historic flood. I've never seen anything like it. And then, the stark, horrifying fact that set the stage for an unprecedented disaster. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 4, 2025, the Guadalupe River in the Texas Hill Country rose an astonishing 29 feet. Paradise wasn't just lost, it was violently erased. What was supposed to be a weekend of celebration became a desperate struggle for survival against a force of nature so sudden and so powerful. Nobody saw it coming. Before the water, there was peace. The Texas Hill Country in early July is a postcard of summer. The air is thick with the buzz of cicadas and the scent of sun-baked limestone and juniper. For generations, families have flocked to this idyllic landscape, seeking refuge from the city heat along the cool, clear waters of the Guadalupe River. At the heart of this tradition stood Camp Mystic, a historic all-girls camp established in 1926 for nearly a century. Was a place of ritual and rite of passage, where girls forged lifelong friendships, learned to ride horses, and sang songs under a vast, star-dusted Texas sky. In the first days of July 2025, Camp Mystic was bustling with the energy of hundreds of campers and counselors. The 4th of July holiday weekend was approaching, and a festive spirit filled the rustic cabins dotting the riverbank. Cabins with charming names like Wigglin were tucked among the ancient cypress trees, their green shingled roofs a familiar sight for the thousands of girls who had called this place a summer home. Nearby, at campgrounds like the HTRTX campground in Kerrville, families in RVs and tents were settling in, ready for a long weekend of grilling, swimming, and making memories. On Thursday, July 3rd, the National Weather Service issued a flood watch, predicting the possibility of heavy rain, perhaps up to 7 inches in some isolated areas. For a region known as Flash Flood Alley, such warnings weren't entirely uncommon. To many, it was just another summer storm on the horizon. James Allison, a retired rancher in Kerrville, remembered welcoming the rain at first. No one, not the residents, not the campers, not even the officials, could have possibly imagined the sheer volume of water that was about to be unleashed. The forecast had dangerously underestimated the storm's fury. As night fell, campers at Mystic and families along the river drifted to sleep to the sound of distant thunder, unaware that the very river that defined their summer paradise was about to become an unstoppable torrent of destruction. In the blackest hours of Friday, July 4th, the sky just opened up, but this was no ordinary summer downpour. It was a deluge of biblical proportions. As much as 12 inches of rain hammered the hill country, all while its residents and visitors slept. The bone-dry creeks and watersheds, baked hard by the Texas sun, couldn't absorb the onslaught. Instead, they became funnels, channeling a catastrophic volume of water directly into the Guadalupe River. The river's response was terrifyingly swift. Between 2 a.m. and 7 a.m., the flood gauge in Kerrville recorded a rise from a placid 1 foot to over 34 feet. Further upstream at Hunt, near Camp Mystic, the gauge measured a 22-foot rise in just 2 hours before it was submerged and failed completely. Locals would later describe the sound not as thunder but as a constant, deafening roar. A survivor recalled hearing thumps against his house around 6 a.m. It was his own shed, being battered by a current that had materialized in his backyard. His wife looked out and screamed, "There's a river back there." For the youngest campers at Camp Mystic, whose cabins were situated closest to the water's edge, the nightmare began in their bunks. 13-year-old Eleanor Lester was startled awake around 1:30 a.m. by the sound of thunder and rain violently pelting her cabin window. Another camper at nearby Camp Valdemar, Alice Sell, peeked through a small hole in her window and saw only water. The Guadalupe, normally a gentle, flowing companion, had become a monster. It was a wall of water moving with incredible force, ripping ancient cypress trees from their roots, swallowing vehicles and tearing entire cabins from their foundations. In less than an hour, an RV park owned by Lorena Gillen in Kerrville was completely wiped away. "This was our paradise," she said later, her voice hollow with loss. "But now it's all gone. There's nothing left." The 4th of July had dawned not with fireworks, but with a terrifying, liquid explosion that caught everyone by surprise. As the churning, debris-filled water surged through Camp Mystic, chaos and terror erupted. Counselors, some barely older than the girls in their charge, became instant heroes. Oticam La Junta. A counselor awoke to find water rising inside his cabin and immediately helped his young campers swim out through a window to safety. At Mystic, amidst the screams and the roar of the flood, the desperate scramble for life began. Cabins housing the youngest children were the first to be hit, the water splintering wood and glass as it crashed through. Across the region, ordinary people were thrust into life-or-death situations. In Ingram, Erin Burgess and her family were forced from their home as water poured in within minutes. For a terrifying hour, they clung desperately to a tree, the current pulling at them relentlessly. She would later credit her 6-foot-tall teenage son with saving her life. "That's the only thing that saved me," she said, was hanging on to him. In another part of the county, a man, in a selfless act of courage, broke through a window to rescue his fiancée, their children, and his mother from the rising waters, severely injuring himself in the process. The stories of survival were as harrowing as they were miraculous. One man, awakened by the flood, grabbed his wife and 2 dogs and jumped into the water. The current swept him 200 feet downstream, where they managed to grab hold of a crepe myrtle tree. With his waterproof phone, he began frantically calling for help, telling rescuers they were in extremis. But for every story of survival, the story of loss was unfolding. A family of 5 was swept away from the HTR campgrounds in Ingram. Another family of 4 vanished when their house was carried away by the river. The most heart-wrenching scene was at Camp Mystic. As the sun rose, revealing the full scale of the devastation, a grim reality set in. More than 20 children were missing. Parents who had sent their daughters off for a summer of joy were now faced with an unimaginable nightmare. Frantically posting photos on social media with desperate pleas for information. One of the most incredible stories of resilience to emerge was that of a teenage girl. She and her family were tent camping at the HTR campground when the flood struck. Waking to water already in their tent, they tried to escape in their vehicles, but the water rose too fast, stalling their SUV. Her father tried to keep everyone calm, reassuring them that help was on its way. Just before the current took him, soon after, the girl and her mother were also swept into the raging torrent. For an unbelievable 15 to 20 miles, she was carried downstream by the violent floodwaters from Kerrville to Center Point. Somehow, she managed to grab onto a tree and held on for hours, battered and alone. Her survival was nothing short of a miracle. As dawn broke on July 4th, the scope of the disaster triggered one of the largest search and rescue operations in Texas history. The scene was one of apocalyptic destruction. Roads were gone, bridges were impassable, and communication lines were dead. The camp itself was without power, water, or Wi-Fi. First responders faced a landscape that was fundamentally broken. The mission to find the missing, especially the children from the summer camps, began with overwhelming force. 14 state helicopters and Coast Guard aircraft filled the sky, their rotors beating against the humid air as they scanned the mangled riverbanks. On the ground, a force of nearly 500 personnel, including swiftwater rescue teams from across the state and the specialized non-profit group Kerr, began the painstaking work of combing through the debris. They deployed boats, drones, and search dogs, navigating a treacherous environment of uprooted trees, buried cars, and the remnants of homes. For the survivors, the sight of rescue was a moment of profound, gut-wrenching relief. At Camp Mystic, Texas game wardens managed to string a rope across a still-flooded bridge, allowing some girls to hang on as they waded through the rushing water to safety. 13-year-old Eleanor Lester, who had been stranded with her on the elevated ground of Senior Hill, described the moment a helicopter finally landed to airlift them out. "It was really scary," she recounted, the trauma still fresh in her voice. In total, over 850 people would be rescued or evacuated from the flood zone, many plucked from rooftops and trees where they had clung to life for hours. Congressman Chip Roy shared the story of one little girl from his community who had been found safe. "She floated on a mattress for 3 hours yesterday morning," he told reporters, his voice thick with emotion. "And we just got the text notice that she survived." The teenage girl who had been swept downriver for miles was finally heard calling for help by a homeowner who found her clinging to a tree in his backyard. He immediately called 911, and rescuers brought her to safety. But the rescue efforts were also punctuated by moments of unbearable grief. As teams searched, the death toll began to climb. At reunification centers, scenes of joyous, tearful embraces were contrasted with the quiet, agonizing weight of families who still had no word. The state and the nation watched and held its breath. Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick made a plea that captured the desperate hope of the moment. "I'm asking the people of Texas, do some serious praying. On your knees kind of praying that we find these young girls." As the floodwaters slowly began to recede, they left behind a scarred and broken landscape. The powerful river had redrawn the map of the hill country, leaving behind a thick blanket of mud and a graveyard of debris. RVs were wrapped around trees like tinfoil, and a kayak was found suspended 20 feet in the air. Governor Greg Abbott, after touring Camp Mystic, described the scene as horrendously ravaged in ways unlike I've seen in any natural disaster. The tops of cabins where the water had crested were a shocking testament to the flood's power. For the survivors, the physical danger was over, but the emotional and psychological toll was just beginning. The community was reeling, grappling with a death toll that had climbed to at least 52 statewide, with dozens still missing. Kerr County bore the brunt of the tragedy, with at least 25 people killed on July 4th alone. The search for the missing, including more than 20 children from the Hunt area summer camp, continued relentlessly. In the wake of the tragedy, difficult questions began to emerge. How could a disaster of this magnitude happen so quickly with so little warning? Many residents and parents reported receiving emergency alerts only after the water had already begun its terrifying rise. Local and state officials defended their response. pointing to National Weather Service forecasts that had drastically underestimated the rainfall. Kerr County Judge Rob Kelly called it a once-in-a-century flood, stating bluntly, "We know the river rises." But nobody saw this coming. He revealed that a proposed, more advanced flood warning system for the area had failed to materialize due to cost concerns. A private forecasting company, however, contended that warnings had been issued hours in advance and that proactive measures like evacuations could have been taken. This debate over preparedness would become a critical, painful part of the flood's legacy, highlighting the immense challenge of protecting communities in one of the most flash flood-prone regions in the United States. In the face of unimaginable loss, the spirit of Texas shone through. Before the floodwaters had even fully crested, communities began to rally. A wave of compassion and support surged across the hill country and beyond. A powerful countercurrent to the destruction. Relief funds were established almost immediately. The Community Foundation of the Texas Hill Country created the Kerr County Flood Relief Fund to channel money to organizations on the front lines. Churches like Southern Oaks Church and Cross Kingdom Church in Kerrville became nerve centers for the relief effort, organizing supply drives and taking in donations. The Salvation Army's Kroc Center mobilized, providing meals and collecting essentials for displaced families. The response was a testament to the power of community. Austin's Jester King Brewery and Dripping Springs Treaty Oak Distillery became collection points for donations. The nonprofit World Central Kitchen dispatched teams to provide hot meals to first responders and stranded campers. Kerr, the volunteer search and rescue organization, put out a call for $100,000 to sustain its critical operations, and donations poured in. From large corporations to local businesses, Texans stepped up to help their own. Governor Abbott declared a state of disaster for 15 counties, unlocking state resources, and President Biden assured full federal support, signing a major disaster declaration for Kerr County. On Sunday, July 6, Governor Abbott called for a statewide day of prayer. In times of loss, he wrote, "We turn to God for comfort, healing, and strength." It was a sentiment echoed across the state, as prayer vigils were held for the victims, the missing, and the heroes who risked everything to save them. The flood had washed away homes and lives, but it could not wash away the resilience and generosity of the human spirit. The recovery for the families and communities devastated by the 2025 Texas floods will be a long and difficult road. The search for those still missing continues, and the rebuilding has only just begun. If you want to stay updated on the recovery efforts and hear more stories of this community's resilience, please subscribe to our channel. The organizations on the ground are in critical need of support. If you are able to help, please consider donating to the Kerr County Flood Relief Fund, established by the Community Foundation of the Texas Hill Country, or to established organizations like Kerr, the American Red Cross, and the Salvation Army, who are providing direct aid to the victims. Every contribution, no matter the size, makes a difference in helping these communities heal. The Texas flood of 2025 will forever be etched in the state's history as a story of profound tragedy. It's a story of a beloved summer camp, a place of joy for generations, turned into a center of unimaginable grief. It's a story of lives cut short, of families torn apart, and of a community brought to its knees by the terrifying power of nature. But woven into the fabric of this tragedy is another, more enduring story. It's the story of the heroes, the counselors who guided children through floodwaters, the neighbors who risked their own lives to save others, and the thousands of first responders and volunteers who answered the call. It is the story of unbelievable survival against all odds, of a young woman who was carried for miles down a raging river and lived, of a family that clung to a tree and was saved, of a community that refused to be broken the floodwaters made, who have washed away homes, roads, and a century of history along the Guadalupe River. But they also revealed a foundation of strength, courage, and compassion that no natural disaster can ever destroy. The scars on the landscape will heal, but the memory of the heroes, the victims, and the unbreakable spirit of the Texas Hill Country will remain. This was the unbelievable true story of the Texas floods of 2025.